I am going to teach you everything that I know about cold calling, and I've built over 70 B2B software and service sales teams and have personally tracked over 3.9 million cold calls. So I've been around the block when it comes to cold calling and doing cold outreach. And the purpose of this video is to give you everything I know, all of the how to cold call and then why what I teach you works. So then that way you can replicate this in your own organization and build really strong and structured cold calling environments. Because here's the thing, across those 70 companies that I've worked with, for the most part, cold calling has been the number one channel when it comes to doing cold outreach. Outperforming email, outperforming LinkedIn. It's a great channel. And that kind of makes sense, right? If you think about it, what is the best possible thing you could do? Well, it's to be in the room with your prospect, having a conversation in person. But you can't do that at scale. That's why conferences are so powerful, because you have all of the people in one place. Cold calling is the next best thing, but it's underutilized. And in general, when it comes to outbound prospecting, I believe when they zig, you should zag. Even though cold calling, in my experience, has been an extremely consistent channel in terms of generating appointments, it is also one that's not being leveraged as much today, which means you could really set you apart if you have your team doing it. But there's a lot of confusion around the appropriate ways to cold call. So in this video, I'm going to break the whole thing down. But I want to start with the obvious challenge. It's the question I get asked a ton, which is, what about connect rates? Today, dial to connect rates are lower than they've ever been. If you grab a random cold list as of recording this, on average, your dial to connect rate is going to be about 5%. That means you make 100 calls, you're going to talk to 5 people. So it's incredibly inefficient. And there's ways to improve that efficiency that I'm going to talk about here. And then I'm going to get into the dynamics of a cold call and break down a script for you. But let's start with that core challenge. How do we speak to more people? This is really an operations issue and a lead issue. What you want to do is invest 5x whatever you think you're going to need to invest in time and money into the list that your team is calling. I do not want SDRs creating their own cold call lists. I want the list to be created by the organization. It's a company asset and distributed to the reps in order to work those leads to schedule appointments. So that's the first thing. Overinvest in the list. Spend time making sure that every company on that list is qualified. If you have to use your team to manually go through every single company's website, do that, because you want to make sure no matter who you're calling somebody that's qualified or at least meets the basic level of qualification to justify you calling to reach out to them. From there, it's about bucketing leads as you're calling through it. So let's say you have a list of 1,000 companies that qualify for your product or service. What you want is when your team is calling through them to mark if they connected with somebody or not. Did you book a meeting? It should go in the I booked a meeting bucket. If you connected with them, they showed a level of interest, but they didn't book a meeting, then that should go in its own bucket. If they said, I'm not interested, put that in its own bucket too. Like, you want to make sure that you're organizing leads, because over time, you're going to want your team to spend more of their time and effort calling leads that they've connected with before in the past, or somebody has. Because if somebody answers a cold call, that means there's somebody that answers cold calls. And I can prove this to you because a good friend of mine runs a company where all they do is the first touch when it comes to cold calling. So they'll take any list, they'll cold call all of them, and they'll only mark as qualified leads where they were able to connect to somebody and confirm that it was the right person. If you call that list, so the list of people who've answered their phone before in the past, the dial to connect rate on average is 26%. And for clients that I've worked with, I've seen that up to 35%. Well, why is that? It's exactly what I said earlier. If somebody answers their phone once, odds are there's somebody who answers their phone when unknown callers call. So that is critical here. So as you're going through the leads, you bucket them based on if they answer the phone or not, and then have a higher distribution of your calls for your team targeting people who've answered their phone before but haven't booked a meeting yet. This is how you take those connect rates from 5% to 30%. So that's something I want you to keep in mind as you're building out a cold calling program at your organization. So let's dive into cold calling itself, because it doesn't have to be very complicated, and there's a lot of noise out there. There's also a lot of different ways to cold call. So I'm going to share with you some of my philosophy around cold calling. I wrote a book on this called Cold to Committed. I've been running these teams for a decade now, so I deeply understand the environment of doing cold outreach for both software and service companies. And what I would like to really impress upon you here is the power of having a process for cold calling and what structure do you follow. This is what works for me. Test it, try different things. There are a lot of methodologies. This is just what I found to be successful. So the first thing I want to talk about here are the dynamics of a cold call, because there's a lot going on here. Now, of course, for a cold call to work, you have to be able to identify a problem that they are prioritizing solving. Because if you find a problem that somebody has, but there's no real impact of that problem, then it's not a problem worth setting a meeting to try and solve. So let me give you an example of this. A lot of times I'll work with a software company, and what they'll say is that their solution is better because most of their customers before using it were using spreadsheets. Well, that's not a great value proposition, because if spreadsheets are getting the job done, why would you ever need a software to do it? I mean, that's one of the things I feel like we've missed out on over the past several years, is so many software companies have been striving to replace spreadsheets, but there's nothing broken with the spreadsheet in the first place. So that's not a strong enough value proposition. The impact of solving that problem might not be big enough. Now, what if there's a higher chance of human error when using a spreadsheet than using your solution, and you're dealing with an organization where one human error costs them a ton of money? Well, now there's a big impact, right? So that could justify switching from a spreadsheet to a software. Now, that's just an example. There's a whole bunch of these, but I want to stress the importance of having an impact here. What is the impact of the solution? So it starts off, we got the problem. Then we ask the question, does this problem have impact? Now, if it does have impact, the next question becomes, do they have a solution, a proposed solution? What are they trying to do to solve this problem? If they do, great. If they don't, we try to position our solution as the solution to their challenge. If they do have a proposed solution, we ask, are we aligned with that? And if we are, we align ourselves. If we're not, then we're going to go ahead and position our solution. This is at its core what we're trying to do over a cold call. Identify that challenge, make sure we understand the impact of that challenge, and then position ourselves as a solution. And the dream is a cold call. We make a call, explain the high level of what we do, and they say, oh my gosh, I'm looking for a solution like that. Can we meet and talk about it? And then you're like, yeah, book a meeting. Boom, right down the line. That is the dream. But of course, that never happens. What generally happens is this here. We say our intro. They say something, we ask a question, then we go this way because we ask another question. We try to dive deeper in their situation. We're farther away from that line. And then we ask a question to get us back on that line. And then we go ahead and ask a follow-up question. They answer it. It seems like it could be a good fit. Then you ask for a meeting. It is a tree of possible outcomes. And what we're doing when we're cold calling is trying to figure out what questions get us closer to get a meeting booked. What questions allows us to not only identify that there's a challenge that's worth solving, but also understand the priority level to solve that problem and what impact they're expecting from having that problem solved. So my philosophy when it comes to cold calling is we need to be treating these prospects in a way where we're trying to identify what is going on within the organization, what challenges do they have, and then positioning our solution accordingly. If we call somebody and just talk about what we do, what we run into is the prospects bridging the gap between what you've just told them and their current situation to determine, is this right for me? What I want to do is understand their situation first so I can give them the reason why it is a good fit for them. If it is, of course. If it's not a good fit, then we're not going to book a meeting. But that's the idea here. And that's my core philosophy. Now, the prospect goes through a whole bunch of different stages here. So the 4 key stages I want to walk through with you so you have a good understanding of these. The first stage that the prospect is in is go away. They just want you to get out of there. This is where they're telling the rep, hey, I'm not interested. I'm about to hop into a meeting. Can you send me an email? They're just trying to get the rep off of the phone. And a mistake that a lot of reps do in this situation is they're still in, let me try to book a meeting mode, when in reality, they shouldn't be. They're trying to get out of go away mode and get into the next stage, which is I'll talk. If you can take a prospect from go away to I'll talk, that is the biggest battle you have, because the friction on the front end of the cold call is the most challenging to overcome. But once you do, you have a little bit more room for error, and it gives you more flexibility on navigating a conversation to identify that problem that they're having and dive deep into the impact of that problem. So it starts off with go away. When you're in the go away stage, or when the prospect's in the go away stage, our objective is to get them into the I'll talk stage. When they're there and they're having a conversation, we want to get them to I'm interested. That's the next stage here, stage number 3. I'm interested. And in this stage, a lot of problems can come up. At first, when somebody's cold calling, they tend to struggle up at the top where they're like, hey, it's difficult for me to get people from go away to I'll talk. But once an SDR has some experience, maybe they've been cold calling for a couple of months, they tend to drop the ball most on the I'm interested stage. Because when somebody's interested, they tend to ask questions. And when you're talking to somebody on the phone and you have answers to their question, your natural instinct is to answer those questions. But the problem is what you're doing is you're giving information to the prospect that they can use to make a buying decision before ever seeing the product or understanding the service. So they're using a lot of heuristics in their mind to categorize where you fit to either say yes or no. And because we don't have a controlled environment, and this is a total cold call, and we don't know nearly as much about the prospect as we need to in order to help them make a proper buying decision, it can be a huge challenge when you give too much information to the prospect when they're interested, because then they're going to make a decision whether they would buy or not, when that's not what we want. We want them to make a decision on if they want to meet with us to learn about the solution and if it's going to help them solve the problem that we've identified that they need help solving. So what I recommend here is keep the amount of information you give to a minimum. In a little bit here, I'm going to break down our script that goes into a lot of detail here, but for now, that's the main concept I want you to understand. So that was stage 3. I'm interested. The final stage is I'll meet. And when you're in I'm interested, you need to do whatever you can to get to the I'll meet. Not I want to move forward with your solution. Not your solution sounds great, but I'm curious enough to schedule a dedicated time to walk through your product or service. That's what you're doing in that stage. Now, early on, when you have an SDR, they don't fully understand that these stages exist. And if they are behaving in a way that would get somebody from I'll talk to I'm interested, but they're in go away, there's going to be a mismatch and then the call is going to fizzle. So it's very important that, one, the SDRs are aware of these stages. But the second thing is that the SDR needs to realize where the person they're talking to is, which stage are they in, so they can make sure that what questions they ask, what areas they take the calls into align with getting them to the next stage, not to the end result of booking a meeting. This is critical for making sure that we properly navigate cold calls. Now, the next thing with cold calls here is tonality. Tonality is incredibly important. Honestly, a lot of times the tone of voice has a bigger impact than the words they actually say. A lot of times early SDRs are nervous, right? And they sound a little bit weak. And if you've gotten cold calls, you know, most cold callers don't sound all that great. They sound like people cold calling. They might sound a little nervous or like they don't belong. That's the key. And here's what I want you to remember. People, when they're speaking to you, are visualizing you just by hearing the sound of your voice. I often say if Mark Cuban cold called you, you'd probably listen. Even if you didn't know who he was or what his voice sounded like, he's going to sound different on the call. He's going to have a different level of authority. One of the most important rules for cold calling is you need to sound like you belong. It is critical. So if you're listening to an SDR's cold call and they sound like they don't belong, that's where all of the coaching goes. How do we get this SDR to sound confident, to sound like they should stay on the phone with them? That is really the key here. And there are several types of tonality or ways that you'll use your voice on a cold call or when you're talking to gatekeepers to try to enhance the cold call that you're doing. So one of them is just your normal confident sounding voice, much like how I sound right now, where I'm a little bit more dynamic. I'm not always talking at the same tone. I'm dropping my tone a little bit. I'm sounding a little bit more engaged and I'm expressive, right? You'll see I use a lot of body language with that. There's also confusion where it's like, you know what? I'm not sure if this is a good fit. That's why I'm giving you a call here, right? You want to also be able to use a confused tone when you need to. You know what? I'm actually curious here. What motivated you to implement that solution in the first place? Sounds very different than my normal speaking voice, right? This is the type of thing you need because the person on the other end of the phone is perceiving. They're visualizing the person that they're talking to. So for example, if I say, what motivated you to install that solution? Versus, curious, what motivated you to install that? Two totally different tones of voice. The feeling is different. That's really the key that I want you to understand here. So tonality is important. And then there's a natural question. How do we have great tonality on cold calls? Well, the first is something you've seen me doing already. The power of body language. You'll see I smile when I want to sound enthusiastic. I won't smile if I'm trying to sound more serious. You can hear in my voice the difference based on body language. So let's do an example right here. What I want you to do is I want you to sit totally normal and I want you to say, hey, this is Kyle calling from Voris. Hey, this is Kyle calling from Voris. You probably sound excited, enthusiastic, have a smile on your face, do it again, and really try to embody an exciting persona. Hey, this is Kyle calling from Voris. And now try this. I want you to slump your shoulders. I want you to frown a little bit, look sad, feel sad, and try to say, hi, this is Kyle from Voris with the same level of enthusiasm and excitement as you did when you're smiling and your shoulders are back and you're sitting up straight. You can't do it. It's impossible. And the reason is because there's some connection between our body and our voice. So it's very important that when you have a team of SDRs that you're helping them control their body language so that way they're being perceived appropriately on the cold call. This is incredibly important and often overlooked. Now, there's another thing that you can do that has a really big impact on tonality. And this is putting the reps in a state where they're the most energetic, the most confident, the most enthusiastic. You know, I have a sales training book or a sales book that was printed 100 years ago. And I go through the book every now and then. And one of my favorite parts is he talks about the importance of enthusiasm and the impact that enthusiasm has in the sales process. This is a 100-year-old sales book, and it's talking about the power of enthusiasm. And if you think about it in your own life, you could probably realize how powerful this is. If you've gone to a Starbucks early in the morning and there was one employee there who's really high energy, can you visualize that person today? Do you somewhat remember them? Well, it's because they stood out. They had enthusiasm. That's so important when you're cold calling because most people cold calling do not have that level of enthusiasm. They don't have that level of confidence. They don't sound like they belong. So here's what I want to do. When I have a rep that I want to get into a state of high confidence and high enthusiasm, I ask the rep, when did you feel the most enthusiastic or when do you feel the most confident? So for me, I used to do stand-up comedy for 5 years. My most exciting moments are that walk from the side of the stage to the microphone. That's when I feel the most enthusiastic, the most confident, where I'm the most excited. So if I close my eyes and I put myself back there, and this is what I want you to do with your reps, have them close their eyes, put themselves back in that moment. Maybe they played baseball and it was when they were throwing their pitch. Maybe it was before they did a performance at a play, whatever it is for them. Put them back there, have them really visualize themselves there. And what you'll see is they'll start to be able to tap into that energy. And if they bring that energy to a cold call, it's going to be way more effective than if they don't have that energy. And we're about to transition here to talk more about the script, but you have to understand that tonality has to come first. We could just read through a script and book a meeting. That is definitely possible. But what takes an SDR who's cold calling from okay to spectacular is their ability to use vocal tone and vocal variety to be engaging and to sound like they belong in the conversation. It is a complete completely different experience for the prospect. And this is what I want you to work on with your team to make sure that we are creating teams that speak with confidence, that deliver with confidence and sound like they belong. So make sure tonality is part of the equation here for you. All right, so let's jump into what a cold call actually should sound like. Now, the introduction is a really important part of the cold call. It's where you have the least room for error. And if you find a lot of the cold calls your team is doing, they're getting hung up on really early in the conversation, it's because our intro isn't where it needs to be. So here's what I want to break down for you. There's two real types of introductions. One is the permission-based opener, and then the other one I'll just call the standard cold call opener. So when I was being trained to cold call back in the day, I was always taught never to ask for permission and to jump right into your pitch. So that might sound something like, hey, this is Kyle calling from ABC Company. We help chiropractors improve their patient experience by allowing them to schedule appointments after hours. Curious, how are you currently managing after hours bookings? So right into the conversation. This is what I did for a really long time. And when I started running SDR teams, I began testing a bunch of different intros. And what I have found is that permission-based openers generally work better. But the reason why I want to highlight the standard intro is sometimes that is better to do. So keep it on your radar that sometimes just jumping right into it is the better way to do it. But in my experience, the permission-based opener has been the best. Now, there are two types of permission-based openers. One is what you've probably heard before, which is a very short one where they say, hey, this is Kyle calling from ABC Company. This is a cold call. Do you want to hang up now, or will you give me 30 seconds to explain the reason for my call? That's a very common one. There's different variations of that where it's just real quick to the point. This is why I'm calling. Will you give me a minute here to explain why I'm calling? Totally fine to use those type of permission-based openers. I use something a little bit different here. What I do is I say, hey, this is Kyle calling from ABC Company. I'm not sure if we can help each other. You mind if I ask you a couple of questions and let you decide if we should chat? That's the type I like to use, and I'll give you my preferred intro here in a minute, but I want you to understand why I like that better. Going back to what I mentioned earlier in this video, really it's critical to sound like you belong, and I do not want to start a cold call off with, hey, I know I shouldn't belong. Do you mind if I take a little bit of your time to explain why I'm calling? This type of dynamic isn't great because we're doubling down on the wrong foot that we potentially have from cold calling in the first place. So what I like to do is assume it's okay for me to be there, come from a place of curiosity, and ask for permission that way. Now, how I structure this is I start off by saying, how's it going? Hey, this is Kyle from Voris. How's it going? Not everybody believes this is the right way to cold call. And if you get people hanging up from that point, cut that part out of it. I've tested starting with how are you and different variations of how are you for a long time, and it hasn't had a big impact on conversion rates of cold calls. So I talk that way, so I include it in there. And that's another thing that's key. The comfort level of the SDR when using the script does have a big impact because it comes back to sounding confident. I say, how are you? So I include it in the script. I haven't seen a big negative from doing that. Some people are very passionate about not saying, how are you? Feel free to cut it out. I'm not married to it. It's just how I talk, and it's worked really well for me. Now we'll start there, and then we immediately go, we help type of company solve X problem. Not sure if we can help each other, but I thought it was worth a quick call. You mind if I ask you a couple of questions and let you decide if we should chat? Now, the goal here is to get them to say, sure, ask me a couple of questions, and now we're in. But a lot of calls are going to result at this point in what I call a brush off. This is when somebody says they're not interested. Somebody says, I'm about to hop into a meeting, send me an email. Right at the beginning of the call. These aren't objections. These are brush offs. It's just them trying to get you off of the call. Remember, they're still in the go away phase. We haven't fully made it to let's talk yet. So this is totally expected. Now, how do you handle these brush offs at the beginning of the call? Well, there's a simple framework that I learned when I first started as an SDR that has been really helpful. And I teach it to teams all the time. And I even wrote about it in my book. It's called the AAA: acknowledge, answer, and ask. So when someone gives you a brush off in the beginning of the call, we want to acknowledge what they said so they know that we've heard them. We want to answer their real underlining concern. This is going to waste my time, whatever it might be. And then we want to ask a question to regain control of the call. Remember, whoever is asking questions is in control of the call. So you want to be the person asking questions. Here's how it might sound like. Hey, I hear you. I called you out of the blue here. Let me let you go. I don't want to waste your time. Before I let you go here, we typically help folks solve X challenge or Y challenge. Curious, are you facing either of those today? So that's just an example. Maybe someone says they're about to go into a meeting. You can do the exact same thing. I hear you. I totally called you out of the blue here. The last thing I want to do is waste your time. Let me let you go. Before I do, I was curious. I generally talk to CEOs who struggle with one of two things. Challenge 1, challenge 2. Curious, which one of those resonates most with you? So you see what I'm doing. I'm acknowledging them. I hear you. The last thing I want to do is waste your time. That's the answer. They're worried about me wasting their time. Acknowledge, I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. I'm going to let you go. This is acknowledging what they said. Answering their concern. I don't want to waste your time here. Let me let you go, right? So you can see kind of that acknowledge and that answer are really tightly intertwined together. And then we go into the ask. Is it going to work 100% of the time? No. But guess what? You're not going to book an appointment on a cold call 100% of the time. We're fighting for percentage points, and this is how you do it. Now, my favorite brush off is, why don't you shoot me an email? This is perfect. We want to acknowledge that. Absolutely. Let me shoot you over an email. What's the best email for you? You get the email. Then you're going to answer it. I want to make sure what I send you is actually relevant. The reason why they want an email in the first place is because they're not sure if this is even going to be worth looking into, right? Is it worth the conversation? So you tell them, I want to make sure what I send to you is going to be relevant. And then you ask. I typically talk to CEOs. They tell me they struggle with one or two things. Challenge 1, challenge 2. Which one resonates most with you? So you can see what I'm doing there. Acknowledge, answer, ask. Hey, I totally get it. Let me shoot you an email right now. What's the best email for you? Okay, perfect. And I want to make sure I send something over that's relevant. Generally, when I talk to CEOs, they tell me that they're either struggling with A or struggling with B. Curious, which one of those is most top of mind for you right now? And then we go immediately into the conversation and we forget they gave us a brush off at all. We're not worried about them actually going to a meeting. If they tell us they're going to a meeting again, we'll believe them and let them loose. Odds are they were just trying to push us off of the phone. We're not going to talk about, hey, I'll send you an email. We're going to try to get a meeting on the calendar, but we're using that framework to get through that brush off so we can have a conversation with the person and see if it's a good fit for our product or service so we can actually book a meeting. So that brings me to the next part of the conversation, which is the golden question. So we've covered the introduction, we've covered overcoming brush offs, and now I want to talk about the golden question. This is really the question that gets us into the conversation with our prospects. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is you've heard me use this before, and you're going to have to experiment with different things here. Here are the structures of the two different golden questions that we tend to use. Option 1 here. Typically, we help type of company who are focused on improving problem they typically have, or they're focused on a different problem they typically have. I'm curious, which one of those is a focus for you? Now, option 2. I speak with a lot of title, and they tend to struggle with one or two things. Struggle 1 or struggle 2. I'm curious, which one of these resonates with you the most? The reason why the golden question is so powerful is because we're narrowing down the conversation and we're giving a path that the prospect is going to pick based on what their experience is today within their organization. And that's what I really want, because I need to tailor this conversation based on a problem that they're having. So let them pick one of these options. Now, while you're experimenting, trying to figure out the right golden question to ask, here's what I want you to look at. You first choose two things, right? Either two challenges, two struggles, and you're going to have them choose one of those two things. If they don't choose any of them ever, you need to change out those two things to make sure that there's one in there that they're choosing. Now, as you do more cold calls, you may find that they only ever pick one because that challenge is such a big challenge to them. So they keep picking that challenge, not the other one. Your options in that scenario is to keep testing second challenges or second struggles until you're getting like a 50-50 split between choices. Or you break down that first challenge that you're giving into 2 more specific challenges to hopefully get to that point to where it's 50-50. It's not mandatory. If there's one challenge they're picking and it's leading to good conversations, then keep it the way it is. But the dream is that we have 2 challenges and they're getting picked equally, because that's really doing a good job speaking to the challenge set that this customer type has. Now, after we ask the golden question and we get a response, and let's say they chose struggle number 1, well, we're in a conversation. We've gotten them from go away to I'll talk. And the conversation should always start with understanding why they selected the challenge that they selected. So if they say struggle 1 is top of mind, we want to ask, why is that top of mind for you today? You can ask, why does X resonate with you? To get them to start talking. And from here, I actually break away from the script and I have a framework that I train SDRs on to navigate this conversation, to keep the conversation more dynamic. So let's go through that framework here. So after the prospect has explained why that struggle or that challenge resonates with them, you want to start by understanding the current state. And if you can, you want to quantify this. How many deals are you closing a month right now? And then ideal state would be, how many deals do you need to close, or are you trying to close? So we start off by understanding their ideal state. A couple of questions you can ask here are, what's your current process for whatever you're talking about? How are you currently managing that? How is your team maybe doing with a specific KPI? Like, what's their show up rate? What's their close rate? Things like this. You want to ask questions to really understand the current state. Then we transition to identify the ideal state. You want to quantify this if you can as well. What does the ideal process looks like? How would you like things to work? Where do you need the team's performance to be? When you've gone through these 2 parts of the framework, now we have a gap. Where are they today and where are they trying to go? The final thing we need to do here is figure out how they're trying to solve these problems in the first place. This helps us back into the impact of that problem. What have you tried to improve this? What are you currently doing to solve this problem? How do you think you could solve this? Really start getting an idea of what they're doing in order to solve the problem that they have. And now that we know the gap and we have an understanding on what they're trying and where we would possibly fit, we move on to the next part of the cold call script, which is the recap. The recap is really powerful for a couple of reasons. The main reason is because it shows the prospect that we were listening. We aren't about to ask for a meeting because we're trying to get a meeting. We are about to ask for a meeting because we believe that that meeting is going to get you one step closer to the ideal state you already told us about. Very different experience for the prospect. So it builds a lot of trust. The next reason why it's really powerful to do a recap is because it makes the next step a no-brainer. This person understands our situation enough and is properly positioning their solution as a true solution to our problem. So the recap is a really powerful way to do that. Let me go through the recap here and I'll explain to you why it works. Thanks for filling me in, Name. From what I heard, you are trying, whatever they said they were trying, to get whichever topic resonated with them, some kind of result or improvement. Why don't we do this? Let's set up some time to have a conversation about the topic of the next step that will help you get from gap from earlier in the script. How does tomorrow at 3:00 work for you? The real power of the recap after we've recapped is we say, why don't we do this? It's a very soft way to ask for something. Hey, why don't we do this? I think this could be a good idea to do. And then we're saying, let's set aside some time to walk you through how we've helped other people solve X challenge. How does tomorrow at 3:00 work? Now we're getting direct and assumptive with our ask. We're not saying, would you like to meet? We're not being wishy-washy. We're being direct. But since we use, why don't we do this? We get the benefit of that soft framing with the benefit of that hard ask, which generally comes across as aggressive. It's a really powerful way to ask for a meeting. And the better you can recap, the higher your conversion will be when you ask this question, because you're really showing that you understand their situation. So the recap, even though I give you a structure, can be however you want it to be. The key here is when you're done recapping, you say, why don't we do this? Let's set aside some time, whatever the next step is going to be. And I can show you how we can help you get from A to B, to get from current state to ideal state. How about tomorrow at 3:00? Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you with here is really, why did I say tomorrow at 3:00? You must make sure that the SDRs are booking the appointment as close to the time that they spoke to him on the cold call as possible. Same day is really powerful, by the way, if you can handle it with your operations. Next day is great. The day after that, I try to book it within 3 days of the cold call. That's not always going to work. Now, you can make a rule where you say, we don't book meetings more than a week out, or we don't book meetings more than 3 days out. That's an optimization that I think you should make at some point. But early on, if you're just starting to build out this program, then let them book it whenever they can book it for, but really work with your SDRs to try to get the time between the cold call and the first meeting as close together. This is going to help with your show rates and also making sure the prospect remembers the previous conversation so they have context coming to the meeting. Whew, all right, so that's everything that I know about cold calling, or at least the main things that I know. If you have any questions or you want clarification, put it in the comments below, and I will try to do my best to answer all of them.